I've recently been quite negative about the state of the Disney parks, because the company has just enacted a slate of anti-consumer policies, and I really do think the majority of their new additions to the parks fail to meet the Disney standard. So, to contrast this, I did want to do a video focusing on more positive aspects of the parks. And yet, I found myself completely surprised on where I would find it. I recently went and rode Remy's Ratatouille adventure at Epcot for passholder preview. I have to say that I actually really like it, making it the perfect topic to take things in a more positive direction. I liked it so much, in fact, that I have to wonder, is Remy's Ratatouille adventure better than Rise the Resistance? I certainly think so. It may be a cloned attraction, but it actually makes sense for the France Pavilion, and I was surprised by how different it feels from Disney's other trackless dark rides. So, today I'm interested in analyzing this attraction and breaking down why it's such a win for Epcot. In 1992, Euro Disneyland opened just outside of Paris. The story of the failure of this park has been covered time and time again, so it's not something I'm going to really talk about here. However, the primary takeaway is that this was an incredibly expensive flop for the company. So much money and time had gone into creating one of the best Disney parks possible, and yet Disney completely misunderstood the Western European audience that it was trying to attract. Because of this, the park received a lot of vocal backlash and attracted very little in the way of attendance. However, Disney was contractually obligated to build a second park on the land, and so Walt Disney Studios Park opened in 2002. Using the studio theme as a bland and cheap excuse to construct unthemed buildings, this park itself is an absolute embarrassment for the company. Not only was the park footprint incredibly small, but the distasteful and cheap atmosphere in conjunction with just a small handful of rides made the park seem like a discount version of even Six Flags. When Bob Iger stepped in as CEO in 2005, the park would receive a number of cheaper Band-Aid fixes. This would range from off-the-shelf flat rides like Cars Race Rally, to the sparsely themed Toy Story Playland, which also consisted almost exclusively of flat rides. Other additions would include a clone of the watered-down version of the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, and an indoor coaster simply called Crush's Coaster. This particular attraction would send you through a minute of lightly themed scenes before dropping you into a gravity portion, almost completely in the dark. However, while these additions did at least give the park more to do, its first real substantial addition would be in 2014 with Ratatouille the Adventure, based off of the 2007 film. At this point, trackless dark rides were still a relatively new novelty, and the quality of this ride was far beyond what the rest of Walt Disney Studios Paris offered. Because the rest of the park is so underdeveloped and offers such a hollow experience, Ratatouille definitely feels like a welcome addition and an e-ticket for the park. However, how does the ride fare outside of this context? How does it fit into Epcot? It's interesting how by cloning an attraction and moving it into another park, it drops from an E-ticket to a D-ticket. Before you go and ride Ratatouille yourself if you happen to be visiting Epcot, make sure that you curb your expectations. This attraction might be the highlight of Walt Disney Studios Paris, but at Epcot it's just a nice little addition tucked away into the back, adding just a little bit more capacity to the World Showcase. The queue starts with a decent facade of a theater, and while it looks pretty poor from the Skyliner, it at least makes sense from the ground. As you enter the building, you travel through some wallpapered hallways of the theater and eventually emerge onto the Parisian rooftops. Here, Gusteau occasionally comes to life and goes through a spiel in French. The original attraction in Paris has dialogue in both English and French, which makes sense considering its location. Here in the Epcot version, the dialogue is exactly the same, which I think is a cost-cutting move on Disney's part, but at the same time it at least allows the attraction to feel like a better fit for the French Pavilion. One of the few discrepancies between both versions of the ride is the next room, which is a Parisian studio, providing boarding instructions on the artist's canvas. From here you move through more hallways where you grab 3D glasses and emerge back onto the roof, this time the size of a rat. If you notice, the trackless ride vehicle itself is also a rat, conveying your role in the ride. As you board the vehicle and it begins its run of the course, you first encounter the spirit of Gusteau, who invites you onto the roof of his restaurant to meet with Remy. As you round the corner, you encounter a large wraparound screen that brings you up close to Remy and Gusteau, as Remy attempts to figure out what he wants to make in the kitchen. He eventually decides on making a ratatouille dish before the window panel collapses down and everyone falls into the kitchen below. Here, guests scurry along with Remy on the kitchen floor, trying to avoid the other chefs. Meanwhile, Linguini sees you and tries to lead you to safety into the pantry. From here, the ride vehicles move backwards into the next scene, which appears somewhat randomized as they can take different paths through the giant food and shelves. You can see the eyes of other rats as they hide, and Remy scolds his older brother Emile for stealing food. Emerging back into the kitchen, you witness other rats stealing food, and Linguini attempts to sweep them away with a mop before the head chef Skinner can see them. When he pushes you away with a mop, the ride vehicles spin around as the water effect sprinkles down on the guests. Having now recovered, guests now find themselves under a stove which has a heat effect as it lights. In an attempt to get away, the ride vehicles now find themselves under a delivery trolley that moves out into the restaurant. Skinner discovers Remy, and Linguini quickly comes to push the trolley away before Skinner can see more rats. As the trolley is pushed up against the wall, your ride vehicle and the other rats escape into the wall cavity, and here the different ride vehicles move into their own screened rooms. Once parked, a scene plays out that simulates you and the other rats attempting to escape from Skinner, while also lugging all the food away from the restaurant. As the scene ends, the ride vehicle backs up and continues moving through the wall cavity, eventually emerging out into the kitchen where the chefs and rats are preparing a meal. In this scene, there's a strong and addictive smell of fresh bread as you travel through it, which is definitely a highlight of this attraction. When the rats pop the champagne bottle, riders experience another water spritz effect as they launch backwards, and the vehicle turns into the final scene. The rats here can be seen dining on Remy's creation in this makeshift restaurant, and Remy simply invites the riders in as well. Overall, the attraction is light on narrative and is heavily screen-based. I think a lot of people expect me to dislike it for this reason alone, so let's actually talk about the different elements and see what it does well. Earlier, I made the statement that I liked this attraction better than Rise the Resistance, and I think it's fair to throw in Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway as well. These are all Disney-produced trackless dark rides, so of course the comparison is inevitable. So what makes Ratatouille better than Rise? Well, for me it's purely a matter of personal opinion. First, Disney has killed my interest in their new sequel trilogy because of how poorly constructed and contrived those films tend to be. Meanwhile, Pixar created a masterpiece of a film with Ratatouille, and so I already preferred this attraction just based on IP alone. If you've watched the second video that I ever published, I talk about how poorly utilized the trackless dark ride system is in both Rise and Runaway Railway. One of my largest criticisms was how when compared to the trackless systems at Tokyo Disney like Pooh's Honey Hunt or the new Beauty and the Beast attraction, the rides located in the United States were unnecessarily linear in comparison. Ratatouille itself is mostly linear, other than how the vehicles navigate around each other at the station, but one thing it does do really well is effectively use its space for the chase scene in the wall cavity. Here, the ride vehicles move into their own individual rooms, and the pitch of the riders changes in sync with what's happening on the screen. It may be a screen, but it blends into the overall experience really well because of the room design, and again, the vehicles are capable of that pitch. In contrast, Runaway Railway does something similar in that it sends vehicles into individual rooms. However, the blending between the two rooms is quite poor, and the vehicles don't actually simulate movement during the scene. That's actually a great segue into my next point. One of the largest issues with Runaway Railway is how poorly the sets blend into the building. It's a series of flat walls with, for the most part, unthemed gray floors, and it looks pretty bad. In contrast, the gray floor of Ratatouille makes sense for the overall aesthetic of the ride. Is the floor of the pantry concrete? Probably not, but it's plausible and definitely not jarring. The floor itself is also irrelevant in the many scenes with wraparound screens. It may not look like it blends well on camera, but it definitely does in person. One major difference between Ratatouille and Rise or Runaway Railway is that Ratatouille definitely shares a lot more in design philosophy with Universal's Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man or the various Transformers clones. If you've been on these attractions, you'll know that they consist of a vehicle that simulates convincing movement, while also blending screen-based scenes in with physical sets. It appears that this is exactly what Ratatouille is attempting to emulate, and it does it really well, even if the movement is far less intense. Another important component of these attractions are the various sensory effects that they employ. Heat and water effects are pretty common in conjunction with what's happening on screen, and I enjoy that Ratatouille was able to incorporate this as well. As I stated earlier, one of the highlights of this attraction is also the smell of fresh bread in the kitchen scene, and I definitely think that adding smells to attractions is a fundamental component in making them stand out. Everyone remembers the burning of the Library of Alexandria, or the various smells found on Soarin' or Flight of Passage. People even fondly remember the smell of chemically treated water for various attractions, and so the bread smell is definitely a huge factor in the experience for Ratatouille. I think that these sensory elements, as well as the ability for the vehicle to control pitch, is a fundamental component in why Rise and Runaway Railway feel like underwhelming experiences to me. Imagine that when Kylo Ren attempts to cut his way into the elevator, that the vehicles are capable of slight movement to simulate him jumping onto the roof. When the lightsaber cuts through, hidden heating effects could also simulate the heat of his blade. I don't want to just watch the scene, I want to feel it. Perhaps after you've left the escape pod and are back on Batuu, a sweet earthy smell could be used to help simulate your return. It's not that Rise isn't already doing a lot of interesting things, but it just seems to be missing some elements to me. Simple effects like this would put it over the top, but I also know that I'm in the minority for not really finding the experience all that impressive. However, Runaway Railway is most definitely an attraction that would dramatically benefit from effects like this. This scene that we talked about earlier? If the vehicles were capable of pitch, falling down the waterfall would be a lot more fun. When you splash down under the ocean, a water spritz effect would also be great there too. This scene, where you travel down the sewer, would also benefit from the ride vehicles rocking a bit as if floating in the water. Other suggestions offhand might be a heat effect in the western scene, or a cotton candy or popcorn scent at the carnival. Perhaps the ride vehicles could circle around the tornado and could have a swaying movement as if being blown around by the wind. One effect that's odd to me is at the very end. As the train pulls into the station, Goofy electrocutes himself, and the ride vehicles have a vibration effect that simulates it traveling through the train. This effect seems like it should have also been implemented in the city scene where Pete is on the jackhammer. In essence, I think that the largest factor in what sets Ratatouille apart from the other attractions, at least for me, is the inclusion of those sensory effects. It may seem trivial and is obviously subjective, but I've come to realize that the lack of these effects is a large part of why I find the other trackless rides so underwhelming. Perhaps you disagree with me on how effective the technical aspects of Ratatouille are, but one thing I think a lot of people will agree with is how it fits into World Showcase. If you watched my videos, you've obviously seen how cynical I've been with the inclusion of IP into the Disney parks, and especially with Epcot. I'm thoroughly annoyed that the Grand Fiesta Tour is intruded upon by Donald and Friends. Yes, I understand that Panchito as a character is supposed to be from Mexico, but he does nothing to make the ride any more educational or represent Mexican culture. Frozen Ever After? You've probably already heard my thoughts on that. I think the attraction itself is fine, but I also think it's an insult to the Imagineers who strive to make the World Showcase a place of learning. The attraction itself bears only the most superficial relation to Norwegian culture, and exists as an insult to the intellectual capacity of Disney guests. So, does Ratatouille inspire guests to learn more about France? Well, no. But at the very least, they're actually speaking French in the attraction and featuring French dishes. The film it's based on also captures Parisian architecture really well, and the attention to detail in the preparation of French dishes seems to have gone over really well with French audiences. If there's one thing that World Showcase is known for, it's definitely food, and Remy's Ratatouille adventure fits right in that respect. It may not be educational, but the source material pays respect to French culinary culture. One issue that I've never had with World Showcase, though, is the inclusion of Disney character meet and greets. Perhaps it's Snow White somewhere at the German pavilion or Alice in the UK. Because those interactions have always been minimal and out of the way, it has always felt like an acceptable thematic compromise. I think that's another factor in why I'm okay with Ratatouille's placement. Its thematic intrusion is minimal because it's tucked away around the backside of the France pavilion, and it just doesn't bother me in the same way that the other attractions do. A small note of personal bias here, but I think that a large reason I can't forgive Runaway Railway is because it replaced the Great Movie Ride. It replaced a high-caliber classic with mind-numbing mediocrity. Maelstrom was a deeply flawed ride, but its quirkiness was what made it so charming. To replace it with the very corporate feeling Frozen Ever After is just another sting. Is nostalgia blindness a matter of bias? Sure, but that could be another reason I don't mind Ratatouille as much, considering that it only added to the park instead of replacing something. I've felt very strongly that Disney has been replacing attractions for really no other reason than to save on long-term maintenance costs, when they really should be adding on to what they already have. I've addressed this elsewhere, but Disney refuses to address capacity issues in its parks, when the most straightforward solution is to keep building new attractions. But I digress. To conclude, Remy's Ratatouille Adventure is definitely the attraction I prefer most out of the trackless dark rides built at Walt Disney World. I feel that while screen-based, it does a really great job of blending its scenes together effectively. I'm also of the opinion that sensory effects are a huge factor in putting an attraction over the top. It's something that Ratatouille includes a lot of, and is definitely missing from Rise and Runaway Railway. Last, I feel that the ride makes sense in World Showcase simply because the source material pays respect to French culture. It may not be educational, but at least it's out of the way. I know that a lot of people are surprised by my reaction to this ride, so I'm curious how you feel if you've ridden it. I'm also interested to know if you relate to my point about the various sensory effects. There's just something really cool to me about feeling the heat under the oven, or the spray of the mop, or the smell of the bread. The effects are simple, but I just feel add another huge dimension into the ride. So, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. As always, I recommend hitting the like button if you enjoyed the video, and you can always subscribe and hit the bell notification to be alerted when new videos are released.